The Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens. Does that even cover a piece of 8x10 film? I mean, look at it. It's so puny. Maybe it's used for pinhole photography. In any case, I invite you to take a closer look with me at not only the specifications of this lens, but also some of my sample images of its practical application in the field. As a matter of full disclosure, I am not sponsored by Nikon or the Night at Copal Corporation. I purchased this lens with my own money off of the used market. All of the opinions expressed in this video are my own thoughts and are based upon my own experiences with using this lens. In order to understand some of the manufacturer's specifications of this lens, it's important to briefly review some optical properties. Don't worry, I'll make this as painless as possible. A lens projects a cone of light onto the film plane, and the shape of that defined cone is characterized in degrees. This is what is referred to as the field angle, also known as the angle of coverage. The greater the angle of coverage, the larger the diameter of the cone of light projected onto the film plane. It is important to note that this is often confused with angle of view, which is the cone of light in front of the lens. To understand if a lens can be used with a particular size sheet of film, we are only concerned with the cone of light being projected onto the film plane. That's our focus. Is it all right to reuse that pun? More importantly is the diameter of the cone of light projected onto the film. That diameter is what is referred to as the circle of good definition, or simply put, the image circle. For the 300mm M lens, Nikon reports that the projected cone of light, or angle of coverage, is 57 degrees, which produces a diameter of 325mm at f/22. It is important to note that manufacturers use f/16 or f/22 focused at infinity to report the specifications on their lenses, because this is typically the aperture where the maximum image circle is achieved. Who cares? Why should this fancy technical talk matter to me? I just want to take pictures, Tony. Let me explain. We know that a piece of 8x10 film measures approximately 323mm in diameter from corner to corner. Keep in mind that the film holder covers some of the edges of the film, so the surface area available for exposure is slightly less than 323mm. Since the 300mm M lens projects an image circle that is 325mm in diameter, then we know that the piece of 8x10 film will receive adequate coverage of the projected image cone. In other words, there won't be any areas of the film that don't get exposed to light. Realistically, 8x10 film requires that a lens project an image circle that covers an area of more than 323mm. This is especially true if you want to apply any movements to your image. At 325mm in diameter, the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens doesn't leave much room for the application of movements when focused at infinity. So what happens if you do? Well, if the movements are large enough, then you will end up with an area on the film that is unexposed because the movement extended beyond the image circle. The good news is that in all the years that I've been using this lens, I have never exceeded the outer limits of the image circle. However, in my portrait and landscape photography work, I usually don't apply large movements, and I'm typically not focused at infinity, which happens to be the point that a lens has the smallest image circle. That's an important point to keep in mind, because the closer the camera is to the subject, the more coverage you'll get from the lens. As objects are focused closer than infinity, the image circle diameter increases because the distance between the lens and the film plane increases. Therefore, you can apply greater movements without exceeding the capacity of the image circle. The take-home message is that if you are focused at infinity and want to apply generous movements to your composition, you might be limited by the image circle of the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens. But if your work involves getting closer to your subject, then this lens should serve you well. If the image circle doesn't fit with your lens requirements, then you might be better served with a more traditional lens like the Schneider Symmar 300mm f5.6 lens that has a generous image circle of 425mm for coverage of 8x10 film. It is noteworthy that modern lenses generally will produce sharp and clean images to the edges of the projected image circle and are typically designed to cut off the image circle before any chromatic aberrations begin to occur. Older lenses don't have this, so the image gets soft and fuzzy with swirls around the edges of the image circle. You may have seen this effect in older photographs and possibly even Seek lenses that have this look. Some photographers purposely use these fall-off effects in their images to add interest and character. It's all personal preference. I personally like clean images across the entire piece of film. The take-home message is that the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens has adequate coverage for minor movements on 8x10 when focused at infinity, and of course will work perfectly well with smaller formats. If you aren't aware, the size of the film and focal length are going to affect the angle of view. In other words, the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens on an 8x10 camera is equivalent in the angle of view to about a 43mm lens in the 35mm format. Okay, so now that we've beaten into the ground that the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens adequately covers the 8x10 format when focused at infinity, let's talk about what I see as the most practical feature of this beautiful piece of glass: the compact size and lightweight. Have you seen how puny this thing is? Just compare the size of the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens to the Nikon Nikkor 150mm W lens, which covers sizes up to 5x7. Whoa! Why can't all lenses that cover 8x10 be this small? This lens is so small that the front thread is only 52mm. That means no problem using any of the filter kits on the market. It fits perfectly onto a Linhof Technica style lens board that helps to minimize the unnecessary bulk, which makes it great for hiking. The weight is marvelous as well, weighing in at just under 1 pound. Only the Fujifilm Fujinon C 300mm f8.5 can boast being slightly lighter with a larger image circle of 380mm. I'll talk more about that contender tiny lens later. But first, let's take a look at the anatomy of this lens, which is not all that different from other modern large format lenses. There are basically 4 parts that make a lens fully functional and ready to use on your camera. We have the rear lens element and the front lens element that attach to the shutter. There are several different manufacturers' shutters, but the most commonly used are made by Copal. They are available in 3 sizes, and the focal length determines which shutter size is appropriate for the lens. In this case, the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens is coupled with a Copal No. 1 shutter, which needs a 41.6mm hole to properly secure the lens to the lens board. The aperture ranges from f9 to f128, and the shutter speeds top out at 1/400th of a second. It also has an X-Contact sync socket that allows for connecting the shutter to studio strobes. Since these shutters use leaf-style shutters, they are capable of syncing modern studio strobes to all speeds, which is also a nice feature. If you want to learn how to connect your studio strobes to your large format lenses, I'll leave a link to my video in the description that explains how to do that. Let's assemble this lens outfit. The first thing I like to do is open the press focus lever, also called the preview button. Then I slide the aperture to the largest possible setting to minimize the risk of coming into contact with these very fragile blades. I then attach the shutter to my Linhof Technica lens board by threading the retaining ring on the back side that faces the film plane. I use this adjustable spanner wrench to lightly tighten the retaining ring. There's no need to be overzealous with tightening. Next, I'll attach the rear lens element to the shutter. I like to start by threading counterclockwise to reduce the risk of cross-threading, followed by a clockwise direction. I finish the assembly by threading the front lens element in the same manner. Wow, what a wonderfully compact lens that is ready for action. This is my go-to normal focal length lens when it comes to hiking with the purpose of shooting landscape photography in the 8x10 film size. However, this puny lens does come with some puny drawbacks. As I mentioned earlier, it only has an image circle of 325mm, so it really doesn't leave much room for the application of generous movements when focused at infinity. Keep in mind that this is less of a problem when photographing subjects that are relatively close to the camera. Again, I personally don't recall a single instance where I could describe the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens using carefully selected 4-letter words because I ran out of image circle. Another aspect of this lens that I am not all that fond of is the maximum aperture of f9. While it's not all that bad on this particular focal length, there is definitely a difference in the brightness of the image projected onto the ground glass compared with a more robust lens like a Schneider Symmar 300mm f5.6. Other than those two drawbacks, I really can't complain. In fact, this lens may be the best bang for your buck on the used market. In 1998, this lens retailed for $689.95 according to B&H's sourcebook. That's $1,298.40 in 2024 dollars. Not too bad for a high-end lens. In 2019, I paid $442.98 used, and today it runs in the $400 to $700 range. That's still a great price, especially if you own both 4x5 and 8x10 camera sizes. The Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens can act as a long lens for your 4x5 kit and give you a ridiculously huge image circle without the heftiness. Now that's what I call pragmatic versatility. I think it's worthwhile mentioning that modern large format lenses were designed specifically for applications that required attention to the finest detail with the best sharpness, contrast, and color reproduction available to meet the demands of discerning clients. Large format photography was a medium that wasn't within the budget for most people. It was, and perhaps still is, a unique type of photography. The combination of the large piece of film with the modern large format lens makes for images that are the very best that you can get on film. So the bottom line is that worrying about the brand you choose or if a lens is sharp enough is far less important than matching your focal length to your format, selecting what angle of view you prefer to achieve the results you're after, and deciding if size and weight is important to you. Despite some of the minor aforementioned quirks of the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens, I don't regret purchasing it and have made this lens a permanent part of my 8x10 kit. The 4 elements and 3 groups provide this lens with the capability of making images that are sharp with beautiful contrast and vibrant colors. It gives me the ability to enjoy a normal focal length on 8x10 film without carrying around extra weight. Who wants to be loaded down with dead weight on a long hike? Yeah, sign me up for that, right? In all fairness, I wasn't aware of the Fujifilm Fujinon C 300mm f8.5 lens when I purchased my copy of the Nikon lens. So if I was currently shopping the used market and analyzed the specifications of both lenses more closely, I probably would have sought the Fujifilm Fujinon version because of the larger image circle, lighter weight, and barely larger aperture. At the time of purchase, all I knew was that the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens covered 8x10 film and was much lighter and smaller than my malfunctioning Schneider Symmar 300mm f5.6 lens. Regardless, it's a lens that I have used extensively in the studio for portraits and fairly consistently in the field for landscapes. Here are some examples of my work taken with this lens. Are you considering the purchase of the Nikon Nikkor 300mm M lens or already own it? Leave me a comment below on why you like this lens. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. As always, thanks for watching.